You are listening to Echoes from the Blackfriary, a production created by students of The Ohio State University and partnered with the Irish Archaeology Field School in Trim, Ireland. After hearing Margaret Walsh's story of Man in the Sack, some of the OSU students wanted to see if they could locate the site she described. The 3 students were accompanied by 2 supervisors during their search. Now they will talk about their search, their expectations, and the surprises they found along the way.
From listening to the earlier recordings, we knew that the Man in the Sack was located between the Navan Road and the Rathnally Road. So since the road and field configuration had changed somewhat, we went down the Rathnally Road to see if we could get a better idea of what was the lie of the land from that side. I knew that the most important thing would be to talk to one of the local families who would have had deeper understanding of the local folklore and the local field names. So when we were walking down the road, we bumped into a man on a bike called Jerry Fitzsimons, and he advised us to talk to his brother Mickey, who was a font of local knowledge and was able to tell us a lot more about the field.
And that was called the Man in the Sack down there. And then that was all its years down. The Man in the Rarity was all called different names.
So could you retell us the story about the Man in the Sack so we have it for our reflection?
Well, the Man in the Sack years ago came from out of somewhere around years ago. Remember that was the time of the Troubles. It was really in the time of the Trouble. And this man was in trouble and they got him. And they put him into the sack and drowned him and they brought him out and buried him out in the field. And it was always called down the Man in the Sack.
Mickey's version of Man in the Sack is very different from Sheila's written version from the 1930s. What were your reactions to this new version?
After taking some time to reflect on the differences in both versions of Man in the Sack, I realized that the difference in time as far as when these stories were told probably played a role in each person's rendition of Man in the Sack. You know, when you look at when Sheila told the story during the 1930s, that was fairly recent relative to the Troubles and during the Civil War, fairly recent after the Civil War. And I believe that she was more apt to tell a story that related to consecrated burials and how Man in the Sack was buried relative to a suicide, rather than Mickey's version, which was a later version. You know, there's about a 70-year time difference, where Mickey's version was more about how somebody may have been giving information that wasn't supposed to be given, and that this man paid a price and was drowned and buried in a sack in a bog and was killed. So I believe that the time difference in when these stories were told really plays a role in why these stories were told differently.
So Marissa is the lead folklorist on site and one of the supervisors that accompanied the group on their search. So we would like to ask you how the study of folklore helps us to understand the differences between the 2 stories of Man in the Sack, from Sheila's written version in the 1930s to Mickey's more recent version now.
I think what folklore really brings to this situation is questions about why these stories are being told and what kind of work the stories are doing, because folklore is primarily concerned with people communicating specific things in artistic ways, whether that's stories or pottery or jokes or what have you. It's how people are communicating their identity and their community and whatever else through these artistic means. And so when you have 2 stories that are about the same place, they're fundamentally conveying this land's importance through time. And you can see that even though these stories are very different, what stays the same is the idea that there's a place where this happens. There's an idea of boundary maintenance that's going on. There's this anxiety about death and burials that is fundamentally at the core of both of these versions. Now, when you start examining the differences, really, really interesting points start coming up, and you start learning more about the storyteller themselves and what they're primarily concerned with. So Sheila's is much more concerned with the idea of suicides in consecrated ground, and it's much more based in concerns of what it is to have a Christian burial, whereas Mickey is relating the story to more recent worries about the Troubles in Ireland. And so through the similarities in the story, you get to see overall what is important and how land is remembered, but through the differences, you also the differences reveal more of the individual and the context of the different contexts of the stories.
Many of the OSU students were lucky enough to meet with forensic archaeologist and human osteopathologist Esther Poulis, who works on locating lost bodies. She shared with us some of the challenges she faces in relying on living memory and oral history.
Obviously, the events have been a while, so you always see that people's memories, and you will find this in all kinds of ways, that people's memories are, especially concerning space and directions, very, very different. But I've seen a lecture on cities, and this teacher asked their students to draw a map of New York City where they were studying, and some of them based on the actual pattern of the city, some of them based it on landmarks, some of them based it on places that were important to them, and that's how different people's memories are in relation to places and space. So you can imagine that the kind of information that you would get about an event that took place 40, 50 years ago differs wildly depending on the person.
In this episode, we explored how different interpretations of the same story can contribute to or muddle our understanding of the history surrounding it. The stories surrounding Man in the Sack emphasize how folklore can change over time and space, and the confusion it can present for historians. However, folklore can also offer many advantages when looking at the historical record. In the next episode, we'll be interviewing directors and staff at the site about their understanding of the Blackfriary as consecrated ground, and how folklore and oral history can be used to our advantage in archaeological interpretation of the site. Thank you for listening.